Hello there, and welcome to Intrapsychic Exploration, Implications for Psychedelic Assisted Psychotherapy. We appreciate you watching this video and learning more about this important topic. I'd like to offer some context about how this presentation came to be. First, I think it makes sense for us, the presenters, to introduce ourselves. My name is Ross McDonough. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm a full-time faculty member at the University of North Florida in the social work program, and I have a private practice where I primarily treat depression and anxiety, and I do that from a psychodynamic and relational approach. And I'm presenting today with my former student, Lori Ferguson. Lori, will you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Lori Ferguson. I recently graduated with my bachelor's in social work from the University of North Florida, and I will be attending the University of North Florida for my master's in social work starting this fall.
So, I am an NPR junkie, and about 2 years ago, there was a flood of guest interviews with Michael Pollan, who's a pretty well-respected writer and journalist. He wrote a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, and he was talking about a subject that I hadn't really heard discussed before, which is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And he wrote a book pictured here called How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. And I was just mesmerized and captivated by these interviews. And so I went out, I bought the book, and I devoured it. And I became sort of obsessive about it. And I would talk about this topic to basically anybody who would listen, and that included my students. I started mentioning it in class. And Lori came to see me after class one day and during office hours and said she was really interested in this too. And so we decided to dive into the research literature and find out everything that we could about this topic. And so this presentation is really a culmination of our work together. Lori presented a poster at the University of North Florida in the spring semester of 2020 during a student research symposium. And then we worked on this together. And my guess is we probably have about 100 hours put into this research. So here we go. Our objective today is to help familiarize you with the history of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and kind of where we were and where we are today. We also want you to understand the theory of how it works. And we also want you to have a specific understanding of the role of the social worker or the psychotherapist in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So this presentation was originally delivered at the NESW, that's National Association of Social Workers, Florida State Conference on June 19th, 2020. We don't own the rights to the recording of that presentation, so we're recording this here today so that we can share it with our friends and our like-minded colleagues and anyone who's really interested in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So what is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy? This is an evidence-based, legitimate psychosocial intervention aimed at personal growth where we pair psychotherapy with the ingestion of a psychedelic compound. Typically, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy has 3 phases of treatment. The first few sessions are what we call the preparation sessions. And then those are followed by the dose sessions, where the patient actually ingests a psychedelic substance in session. The social worker does not, or therapist does not. And there are several of those sessions. And then the last part of the treatment is what we call either the integration sessions or the incorporation sessions. There is a general consensus among researchers that psychedelic substances are not addictive, and this intervention has existed for almost 100 years. So psychedelics are nothing new. We have artifacts dating back to 7000 BC in Algeria to show that human beings were using psychedelics. Well, this artifact here is a Mayan artifact taken from Mexico, and this dates back to about 1000 BC. And you find these little mushroom statues all over Mexico and Central America and South America. Ayahuasca, peyote, ibogaine, and psilocybin or magic mushrooms and other naturally occurring psychedelics have been used by indigenous people since the beginning of time. These substances were used in healing rituals and religious ceremonies throughout the millennia. In 1914, Science magazine featured a cover story about an American botanist by the name of Mr. W, who went to Mexico and ingested some psychedelic mushrooms. And he wrote about his experience, and this created quite a buzz across the United States, where people were becoming very curious about psychedelics. LSD was invented by a Swiss chemist, Albert Hofmann, pictured here, on November 16th, 1938, or it's sometimes called Bicycle Day. Scientists and researchers were curious about this unusual compound, and the experiments began. Humphrey Osmond, pictured here, was one of a small group of psychiatrists who pioneered the use of LSD as a treatment for alcoholism and various other mental disorders in the 1950s. He is credited with coining the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting. Although his research into the therapeutic potential of LSD produced promising initial results, it was halted during the 1960s for social and political reasons. LSD therapy peaked in the late 1950s and early 1960s and was widely considered to be the next big thing in psychiatry. At one point, it was very popular among Hollywood superstars such as Cary Grant. Osmond believed that hallucinogens are beneficial therapeutically because of their ability to make patients view their condition from a fresh perspective. Between the years of 1950 and 1965, some 40,000 patients had been prescribed one form of LSD therapy or another as treatment for neurosis, schizophrenia, and psychopathy. Research into the potential therapeutic benefits of LSD and other hallucinogens have produced over 1,000 scientific papers and 6 international conferences. The research soon came to an abrupt halt, however, mostly for political reasons. In 1962, the US Congress passed new drug safety regulations, and the Food and Drug Administration designated LSD as an experimental drug and began to clamp down on research into its effects. The following year, LSD hit the streets in the form of liquid soaked onto sugar cubes. Its popularity grew quickly, and the hippie counterculture was in full swing by the summer of 1967. During this period, LSD increasingly came to be viewed as a drug of abuse. It also became closely associated with student riots and anti-war demonstrations, and was thus outlawed by the US federal government in 1968. By then, some of the researchers, such as Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary, had become a zealot in promoting the use of LSD, and he was fired from his position at Harvard for conducting unethical research with human subjects. The 1980s and 90s saw a renewed interest in the neurobiological effects and therapeutic potential of hallucinogenic drugs. Dr. Rick Doblin, featured here, founded MAPS, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, in 1986. This nonprofit organization is the world leader in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy research today. A number of clinical trials are being performed to test the potential benefits of psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA to patients with depression and various other mood disorders, and their use is still severely restricted.
Current psychedelic assisted psychotherapy research trials. So MAPS is currently doing research on MDMA for PTSD, LSD for therapeutic use, ibogaine for addiction, ayahuasca for drug addiction, and also PTSD. The NYU School of Medicine is doing psilocybin research for a variety of conditions, including cancer patients with death anxiety. And in the United States, ketamine has already been legalized for the use for treatment-resistant depression, and there are still multiple studies underway. The ineffectiveness of traditional pharmaceuticals. So a big issue that faces a lot of people that use pharmaceuticals is the side effects. So side effects they happen while you're on the medication, and a lot of times the side effects will continue even after you discontinue use. For antidepressants such as SSRIs and SNRIs, there can be side effects such as sexual dysfunction, drowsiness, insomnia, nausea, headache, abnormal dreams, agitation, and there's more other than those that I've listed. For smoking cessation medications, there is problem sleeping, changes in behavior, depression, anger, thoughts of suicide, headaches, sleepiness, and strange dreams. In addition to these side effects, daily usage can lead to user error. So having to take the medication at the same time every day or multiple times a day can lead to people forgetting to take it and the medication not working as intended. In addition to what I've already said, ineffectiveness of medications. For 1/3 of people who take antidepressants, they do not work. And psychedelics, however, give the possibility of a cure without the need to take medications every day.
So we said before, MAPS stands for Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. It was founded in 1986 by Rick Doblin, who is still the executive director. He's got a fabulous TED Talk on this topic that you might want to check out. They are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and they are the world leader in the development of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So MAPS helps scientists design, fund, and obtain regulatory approval for studies of the safety and effectiveness of a number of controlled substances. MAPS works closely with government regulatory authorities worldwide, such as the US FDA and the European Medicines Agency, to ensure that all of its sponsored research protocols conform to ethical and procedural guidelines for clinical drug research. MAPS officials say the organization's ultimate goal is to establish a network of clinics where these and other treatments can be provided together with other therapies under the guidance of trained, licensed physicians and psychotherapists. Their donations on an annual basis are somewhere between $15 and $19 million annually. Their budgeted expenditures are around $11 million. It looks like on their website they have about 80 employees. Many of those are social workers. It's an international organization. They started in Boston, but I believe the headquarters is now in California, and they have offices around the world. So let's look at psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and how it works. So let's talk about the unconscious. I'm assuming that if you're here, you have an appreciation for the unconscious. I know that in my 20 years as a psychotherapist, I have a stronger curiosity and appreciation for the unconscious. In the beginning of my career, I was much more interested in cognition and understanding thinking and thoughts in terms of ego functions. And I still believe in strengthening the ego, but I think there is potential to go beyond the ego. So Freud is credited with saying that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. Michael Pollan, who wrote How to Change Your Mind, said, "If dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, then psychedelics are the super highway." So I think it's safe to agree that some of our anxieties, mood problems, and neuroses have a root in the unconscious. And one of the problems of traditional therapies is that we really only have direct access to the ego. So you could think of ego as being synonymous with conscious self, and psyche as being a synonym for unconscious. So what if there was a way to engage the unconscious in the therapeutic process? Sometimes our defense mechanisms that are directed by the unconscious get in the way of our therapeutic work. And what if there was a workaround? So let's look at the inferiority complex. Any therapist can tell you that it's a very common thing for people to come in to see us where they're living their lives as if they're not very valuable. They're not good enough, or they feel like an imposter. Someday somebody will figure out their true value and expose them, and that they'll be known as a fraud. And think about what you would do with a patient like this. I would likely start with cognitive behavioral therapy. And I would explain to my patient that how we think about something has a lot to do with how we feel about something. So I would help my patient to challenge their negative thoughts, and we would challenge those with objective facts. So I might say, wow, you graduated college in 3 years, and people find you attractive, and they compliment you on your looks, and you have lots of friends, and you're well liked at work, and you're successful by any measure of success. Those objective facts don't really line up with the assumption that you're somehow not valuable, right? So I would help that person to challenge their negative thoughts with those objective facts, and also to get into the habit of reminding themselves what that truth is about their value. and I would teach them how to not look to the external world for validation, but to look within for a sense of their own value and worth. I would also likely challenge their negative thinking and its roots in childhood. And I might ask them, does that bully in middle school get to continue to have an effect on how you see yourself today? Does that seem like a reasonable thing to do? And after all that, that client can tell me, I know I'm valuable. I understand that objectively. I see it, but I just don't feel valuable. Let's look at death anxiety. So if somebody came to me about death anxiety, I would dust off my copy of Staring at the Sun with Irvin Yalom and or Man's Search for Meaning with Viktor Frankl, and would likely engage in an existential psychotherapy where we would look at the big questions about life. Why are we here? And what is the purpose of life? And I would get that person to think about what they value and review what's meaningful for them. And then we would look at designing a life where they live in accordance to their values, a life that they can feel proud of, so they feel like they're making the best use of the time that they have. Then we would talk about designing their legacy and how do you want to be remembered, and how do we do things today that affirm the legacy you wish to leave behind. And I would encourage them to think of their lives like a pebble being thrown into a pond. And long after the pebble sinks to the bottom of the pond, the ripples extend way out. And that's like a metaphor for our lives, that we go on and impact the world long after we're gone. I would help them deal with their regret, and I would help them to look at the story that they tell themselves about life beyond death, and help them to learn to accept that. And even after all that, what if that person still said, I just can't help it, but I still fear death? Now, my students will tell you that I just loathe that self-help book industry. And here's why. The primary supposition of this industry is that if you gain the knowledge contained in these books, you will then know how to fix your problem. But here's my issue with this. Most people already know how to solve their problems. Take weight loss, for example. There isn't a person on earth who doesn't know how to lose weight. You eat less and you exercise more. All smokers know how to quit. They know what patches are. They know what gum is. They know what Chantix is. What about drug addicts? They know what rehab is. They know what 12-step meetings are, yet they just can't take that first step. Why is that? There's a reason other than knowledge that prevents us from changing. And I tell my social work students, don't think you can just tell people what to do and then expect change. People don't change for lots of reasons. It could be fear of failure. They don't believe they'll be successful, or they can imagine the pain associated with change. The social worker helps people to identify what the barrier is, and then we figure out how to traverse it together. And I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying or what I'm about to say. Traditional psychotherapy works for most people most of the time, but it does have some limitations. And in order to understand psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, we will need to understand a concept called the default mode network. So you may recall a television show that was popular in the 90s and early 2000s called Kids Say the Darndest Things. I think Bill Cosby hosted a few seasons of this show. And basically what they do is they take young kids and they dress them up and put them on the stage, and some gregarious host basically lobs softball questions at the kids, and then everybody laughs at what the children say. So an example might be, where do babies come from, right? And the kids say funny things and everybody laughs. It's kind of a G-rated show on par with like America's Funniest Home Videos or something like that. And we're all familiar with kids saying interesting and funny things. I know my own son, who's 13 now, when he was about 3 years old, he was trying to express the concept of a long time ago. But instead of using that conventional way of saying it, what he said was far day ago. And we all laughed and thought that was really cute. And that's an interesting thing that, he said it that one time, but he never said it again. And I think what this illustrates is that the possible combination of word choice was much wider at 3 years old than it was at 5 years old, because along the way, he learned to conform to the mainstream way that people use language, right? And so that's why he was able to say far day ago, and now he says long time ago. Imagination in children is boundless, and everything is worthy of exploration. And that's why we can get away with the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus and all that kind of stuff. It's why kids can't watch scary movies, right? Because they can't differentiate between what is real and what isn't real. And we all remember the McMartin daycare fiasco and all the times that children have not been reliable or had a loose grasp on what reality is. As we get older, we come to understand the difference between fantasy and reality. Our capacity for imagination constricts, and we find exploration less and less useful or even necessary. When is the last time you did something creative, right? Now think about all the bad poetry that you wrote when you were a teenager. Think about all the magic that Star Wars had when you were 6 or 7 years old. Think about how magical and open-ended the world seemed when you were 5. A couple of years ago, there was a documentary that came out about Mr. Rogers, and there was also the feature film starring Tom Hanks. And I noticed that people of my generation who watched Mr. Rogers as kids, when we watched those movies, we teared up and we got emotional. And there was this profound flooding of emotional energy. And it's really curious to me and hard to understand, because I can tell you, as somebody who watched Mr. Rogers, the show was far from sad. It was a really happy show. It was a really neat place where imagination was encouraged, right? I think the reason why we get sad when we look at Mr. Rogers as an adult is we miss that part of ourselves. We miss that childhood where imagination was boundless and exploration was so important. So what ruins this for us? Frankly, it's wisdom. As we age, we pay attention and we start to understand the way that things work. And most of you have already come to conclusions about what it means to be happy, healthy, and well. The older we get, the more stubborn we become in our opinions. And why is that? It's because we know that we're right. Preschoolers ask why, but why, but why? We grow arrogant in our wisdom. Wisdom and experience make it possible for us to tell the story about who we are and what is possible, why things are the way they are. Wisdom, however, is the enemy of creativity, wonder, and exploration. As we age, our brains become more flexible, become less flexible, more rigid, and more closed off to new possibilities. And this brain rigidity comes with a host of problems. We think of wisdom as being a reward for old age and something to be treasured. But what if that wisdom comes at a price? What if some of those nuggets of truth are just wrong or incorrect or invalid? What if that wisdom sounds something like, I cannot live without cigarettes, or death is terrifying, or I'm not valuable, or I'm all alone and no one will ever love me, or I'm a depressed person and I will always be this way. So let's look at the default mode network. This is the region of the brain that's responsible for our sense of self and who we are. It's basically our ego, our conscious self. And let's look at the functions of the default mode network, which is basically the neurological basis for the self. In this part of our brains, we keep the story that we tell ourselves about who we are. It's where we store our memories, the facts of our lives. It's where our emotional state lies. It's how we see ourselves and how we think about ourselves and how we feel about ourselves. It's also where we go to think about others. This is where empathy is. This is where emotions of other people are perceived. This is where we understand other people and we make moral reasoning decisions, and we categorize people into different groups. It's also where we store our memories of the past and where we imagine the future. So if we think of depression as sometimes been identified as being stuck in the past, and anxiety is a fear of the future. That's happening in the default mode network. This is where we keep our understanding of the narrative of our lives and what we can expect. Now, traditional psychotherapy is a wrestling match with the ego or the default mode network. Sometimes we can get people to attach new meaning to their trauma, or write a different narrative about who they are, or come to a new determination about their worth. We can see in brain imaging that the default mode network looks characteristically different in people who suffer from addiction, or severe depression, or severe anxiety, or trauma. As children, our default mode network is permeable, flexible, and open. Our perception, attention, and consideration is like a lantern. And as we become more wise, it's more like a flashlight, or maybe even a laser pointer. When my son said far day ago, his default mode network was more like a lantern. And over time, as he learned the traditional way of speaking, it narrowed more like a flashlight. That's why it's easy for kids to believe in fantasy, and why creativity and certain types of learning are easier for children. As we age, our default mode network constricts. So think of it as a lantern versus a flashlight or laser pointer. When a person is under the influence of psychedelics, their adult default mode network resembles a child's default mode network. The psychedelic operates like a Control-Alt-Delete in the default mode network. Psychedelics allow for an egolytic experience where one is able to muffle or silence the ego. Some refer to this as ego death. The ego is responsible for maintaining the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious realms of the mind, and the boundary between self and other. It is only when these boundaries fade or disappear that we're able to let go of rigid patterns of thought, allowing us to perceive new messages or new meanings with less fear. When the self or the default mode network disintegrates, the brain's overall connectivity increases, allowing brain regions that don't ordinarily communicate to form new lines of communication, as you can see here in this model taken from an MRI of patients who are given the placebo or psilocybin or magic mushrooms. Through the use of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, we construct new meaning, new truth, and we abandon the old rigid patterns of self and other perception. These new truths or new meanings have a new weight to them. Participants describe the new narrative as something they don't just believe, but something they feel in their gut and in their heart. These insights become more compelling, stickier, and harder to avoid thinking about. People come to truly believe in their heart that they are good enough and worthy of love, that death is not the end, but just a transition and not to be feared. And if you think about it, addiction really is a story that we get stuck in, a story that gets reinforced every time we try and fail to quit. So somebody might say, I'm a smoker and I am powerless to stop. The psychedelic journey allows people to get some distance and perspective with this belief. They can see the bigger picture and can see the short-term pleasures of smoking in the larger, longer-term context of their lives. Psychedelics can be used to treat all sorts of behaviors and problems beyond addiction, though. Participants have the power through this dramatic experience to slap people out of their old stories that they tell themselves about who they are. It's a reboot of the system, a biological Control-Alt-Delete. Psychedelics open a window of mental flexibility of which people can let go of the mental models we use to organize reality. Let's take a look at all the different psychedelic medicines and how they are used in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
Psilocybin for cancer anxiety. Research on psilocybin started with studying its use in treating cancer patients that suffered from death anxiety. Anxiety and depressive symptoms are common in 30 to 40% of patients in a hospital setting with cancer and other terminal illnesses. Some patients also experience spiritual and existential distress. Currently, there are no FDA-approved medications for psychological distress caused by a cancer diagnosis. However, studies have shown that patients' moods improve almost immediately after taking psilocybin, and the decrease in anxiety and depression can last for up to 8 months after just one dose. Psilocybin experiences also improve spiritual well-being. Psilocybin for smoking cessation. In the 1950s to 70s, psychedelics showed promise in the treatment of addiction. In the US, smoking-related deaths account for 480,000 deaths a year. Behavioral interventions have less than a 35% success rate at the 6-month mark. The Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine did a study on the use of psilocybin in smoking cessation. Over a 15-week period, participants were given cognitive behavioral therapy weekly and psilocybin at 5 weeks, 7 weeks, and 13 weeks. Each participant had 2 to 3 people overseeing the psilocybin treatment. At the 6-month follow-up, 80% of participants were abstinent from smoking. Psilocybin for alcohol dependence. The University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center conducted a study on psilocybin-assisted treatment of alcohol dependence. The treatment lasted 12 weeks and included 7 sessions of motivational enhancement therapy, 3 preparation sessions, and 2 debriefing sessions. Psilocybin was given at 4 weeks and at 8 weeks. Larger doses seem to be needed in the treatment of alcohol dependence, as some participants are insensitive to the effects of psilocybin. The number of drinking days and heavy drinking days dropped significantly after just the first dose of psilocybin.
So, MDMA. MDMA might be the next approved psychedelic assisted psychotherapy medication. MDMA is a synthetic drug with a chemical structure similar to methamphetamine meets mescaline. So it's got a stimulant effect as well as a hallucinogenic effect. MDMA is more commonly known in the festival crowd or the club crowd as ecstasy or Molly. We are now in phase 3 clinical trials with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It's the front runner of the movement because MAPS believes that there will be, some Americans who will not support psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy because of the negative connotation of psychedelics. And the thought is that the most conservative people in this country will likely feel a lot of compassion for those who are suffering from combat PTSD, our veterans. And so the thought is that if there's a medicine that can help those people, veterans with combat PTSD, why wouldn't we use it, even if it is a psychedelic? So MDMA counters the neurologic effects of PTSD, which manifest as hypoactivity in both the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, and hyperactivity in the amygdala. In phase 2 trials, we saw really amazing results. More than half of the patients who received the active MDMA dose no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And if we looked at those same people a few months later at the 12-month follow-up, 2/3 of those patients, or 68%, were no longer categorized as having PTSD, indicating that prolonged healing was possible long after the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Phase 3 results will be out soon, and the initial indications are very positive. MAPS is refusing investment funds from pharmaceutical companies and has plans to synthesize the medicine to be available by prescription for the purchase of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. MAPS will be the only nonprofit pharmaceutical company in the United States. FDA could approve this intervention as early as 2022. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy allows participants to lower their guard and trust their therapist in a meaningful way, where deep work can be done to heal the wounds of their combat trauma.
Ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. Approximately 1/3 of people having taken SSRIs or SNRIs have treatment-resistant depression. The National Institute of Mental Health began looking into ketamine in the 1990s as an alternative to SSRIs and SNRIs. Several therapists in the mid-2000s began administering intramuscular ketamine within a therapy setting as a treatment for depression. Depression symptoms and suicidality decreased after just 1 session of IV ketamine. However, symptoms returned shortly after, leading to a need for more than 1 session of ketamine infusion. Generally, there are 6 sessions over 2 weeks and further sessions at various times depending on the client and the practitioner. After the initial 2 weeks, therapy moves to a maintenance approach with occasional dosing of ketamine to prevent significant relapses. There are several different ways that ketamine can be administered: intravenous, sublingual, intranasal, and intramuscular.
We live in Jacksonville, Florida, and there are a few providers who actually do this in their office. Ketamine is the only psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy that is legal at this point in time. Psychiatrists typically will have you come in and you get a ketamine infusion, and then you have somebody drive you home. I'm not sure if in Jacksonville those practitioners are also incorporating psychotherapy. We're not quite sure.
LSD and microdosing. Microdosing is taking about 1/10 of a normal dose of LSD. This helps to improve daily function without the mind-altering effects of a full dose. Microdosing can also help alleviate psychological and physical symptoms such as headaches and anxiety. Self-rated effectiveness of microdosing is rated higher than traditional treatments for mental and physical symptoms. However, full doses of LSD was rated higher for mental disorders. Microdosing doesn't cause unwanted effects like traditional medications do.
So ibogaine. Ibogaine is a naturally occurring psychoactive substance that has been demonstrated to interrupt substance use disorders, as well as possess other neurological and psychological benefits. It's found naturally in a number of plant sources and has been used for centuries in West Africa for ritual and healing purposes. Ibogaine has been associated with the treatment of opioid dependence, and according to practitioners, ibogaine can interrupt the physiological process of withdrawal, leaving its users no longer dependent on opioids. Patients don't go through detox. They do not have physiological symptoms due to physical withdrawal. Similar to other psychedelic assisted psychotherapies, ibogaine hits a reset on the default mode network, making it easier for patients to restore their sense of identity as a non-addict. Ibogaine is not legal in the United States. However, there are practitioners who travel with their patients to Mexico or the Bahamas, where the substance is legal and can be used in accordance with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Ayahuasca is very commonly used to treat trauma. Ayahuasca, also known as the tea or the vine, is a brew made from the leaves of a shrub that grows in South America. This drink was used for spiritual and religious purposes by ancient Amazonian tribes and is still used as a sacred beverage by some religious communities in Brazil and North America. Traditionally, a shaman, an experienced healer who leads ayahuasca ceremonies, prepares the brew by boiling torn leaves of the plant in water. There are retreat centers all over South and Central America where psychonaut tourists can pay to participate in a religious ceremony to bring about healing from trauma. Ayahuasca is legal in the United States, but only if it's used in the context of a religious ceremony. And there are several churches around the country that offer this experience. The Church of the Mother Earth in Orlando is one of those churches, which is kind of interesting because you don't really think of Orlando as being a spiritual place, but you can have your ayahuasca spiritual experience in Orlando, Florida, while you're on vacation with your kids to go to Disney World. So let's talk about the role of the social worker in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. The social worker plays several different roles. First, they're going to evaluate to see if the candidate is appropriate for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. They're going to be the therapist, the practitioner. They're also going to be like a guide or a coach while the client is under the influence of the psychedelic as a support to them. They're going to really facilitate the entire process. The social worker in this intervention is really the lead worker. Is a physician who prescribes the medication, but the social worker is with that client throughout the entire process. They are the primary practitioner. So first, patients are evaluated to make sure that they're appropriate, and they're also examined by a psychiatrist who writes the prescription. Then they go through 3 phases of treatment. There are a few people who would not be appropriate for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. For example, if you have a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, or you suffer from delusions or paranoia, or you have maybe dissociative identity disorder or multiple personalities, those people would not be able to participate in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Wouldn't be safe. There's some medical conditions that wouldn't make it safe. When Michael Pollan was going to go through PAP himself, he met with his doctor, and his doctor said, all of those psychedelics are fine with the exception of MDMA, and that was because Michael Pollan has a heart murmur. And so because MDMA has a an energizing stimulant effect, he wouldn't let him take it. So that's why Michael Pollan did LSD and psilocybin assisted psychotherapy. So there are 3 phases of treatment. Phase 1 is the preparatory sessions. Phase 2 is the dosing sessions. Phase 3 would be your integration sessions. The whole entire process could be completed in about 10 sessions or less. So these prep sessions are structured just like typical 1-hour sessions. So the therapist would conduct a biopsychosocial and do treatment planning and goal setting, and they'll give out flight instructions, which I'll talk about more in a minute. There are several different or several separate prep sessions, typically 2 to 5. And the goal of the prep sessions is to completely prepare the patient for what to expect and how to proceed when they're under the influence of the psychedelic. So flight instructions are very specific rules about what to do while you're under the influence of a psychedelic. And so they're given to the patient in the prep sessions. And specifically, it's what to do if you're experiencing anxiety or uncomfortable feelings. Obviously, a lot of patients are scared of having a bad trip or a scary experience. So they're instructed that if you are visited by a monster or some other scary creature, you should try to avoid feeling threatened and to embrace your curiosity. And they're told that, you know, everything that you experience under the influence of a psychedelic is a manifestation of your own mind, and it can't really hurt you. So if a threatening creature approaches you, what you're supposed to do is plant your feet, look that creature right in the eye, and ask, what do you have to teach me? Patients are assured that they'll never be alone, and if they do become overwhelmed, they can just simply open up their eyes. The most visual part of psychedelics would happen when the clients have their eyes closed, so you can very easily interrupt that by opening up your eyes. The dosing sessions are done in a different kind of environment, and they are facilitated by a male and female co-therapy team. These sessions are longer. They last several hours. So for a psilocybin session, it might last 3 or 4 hours. For LSD, it could last 8 or 10 hours. These sessions take place in what looks like sort of a new age bedroom, sort of. There's a bed in there and chairs. Sometimes there's bean bags and that kind of thing, soft lighting. Clients are given the medication and then they're asked to state an intention that corresponds to their treatment plan. So for psilocybin, for example, they would lay down, they would have a blanket put over them, they'd get comfortable, they'd have a blindfold covering their eyes to help them to have the experience of the psychedelic. They'd be listening to music through headphones, and the music is a very carefully curated playlist of instrumental music. The co-therapists are there the entire time. They hold the patient's hand and comfort them if they need it. They help them go to the bathroom if they need to. They offer reassurance. The primary role of the therapist during this dosing session is to support the patient, help them feel comfortable. There's very little communication with the therapist. Patients are encouraged to go within their own self through the use of the psychedelic. There may be only one session or several, depending on the situation. Some dosing sessions do involve more interaction with the therapist. MDMA sessions, for example, use a lot more verbal therapy as part of the dosing sessions. But for psilocybin, you're mostly going to be, with your eyes closed. For psilocybin session, we're looking at probably 3 hours. LSD is going to be much longer. Phase 3 would be the integration sessions. So a lot of people who have a psychedelic experience feel as if they have been handed these very important truths or revelations. And they don't really necessarily know in the moment what to make of that. And so the integration sessions are where they understand those revelations that they've had delivered to them. And the therapist helps the patient to process their experience and to talk it through and to understand it, and to take those experiences and integrate them into their lives in the healthiest possible way. How do we make use of what you've experienced, and what are the implications for how it's going to change your life? Sometimes integration sessions will be 1 or 2, others may have more. it's just really important for the patient to come to a deep understanding of their experience. So Lori and I are social workers, and our professional organization is the National Association of Social Workers. And this organization is responsible for our code of ethics. And so we wanted to, because we were presenting this at an NASW conference, we wanted to talk about ethics along the lines of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So here's what we know. It is not legal to practice psychedelic assisted psychotherapy unless you are part of a sanctioned FDA research study. And there are therapists out there who are practicing this underground, who are doing this illegally. And what if it becomes legal? What will NASW say about this? And the truth is, we really have no idea. Even though there are several recently written publications in peer-reviewed journals written by social work scholars, and most of them are supportive of this movement, NASW seems to have completely ignored this intervention so far. If we look at our professional values and ethics, there are a couple things that would have to change with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy if social workers were going to do this. One is our current code of ethics dissuades us from engaging in physical contact. We are not encouraged to hold people's hands in session or to give them hugs if they look like they need one. We're taught to use our voice and to use our empathy as a hug rather than, giving people hugs. So obviously that would have to be looked at. Also, we have really clear boundaries about what to do with clients who lack decision-making capacity. So if a client makes a decision while they're under the influence of a psychedelic, what do we do with that? Can we accept that, given the fact that they are under the influence of a psychedelic? So as you can see, there are several different things that we would have to look at here in order for social workers to ethically engage in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
So MAPS has their own code of ethics. It's an MDMA code of ethics. However, it's general enough that I feel like it could apply to other psychedelics as well. I feel like it does align really well with the NASW code of ethics. There are a few different things that are in this code of ethics that aren't in the NASW code of ethics. So one of them is like use of touch. Like McDonough said, use of touch is generally dissuaded in the NASW code of ethics. However, it's a big part of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So under this code of ethics, it says to discuss touch during intake, how and when it would be used, absolutely no sexual touch, obtain consent before treatment, and during therapeutic touch, and patients can stop at any time. He also mentioned the patients who lack decision-making capacity. So special consideration for non-ordinary states of consciousness is a section in the MAPS Code of Ethics. And it says participants in non-ordinary states of consciousness need special attention to safety and consent, do not engage in coercive behavior. Working with participants in the state can uncover unconscious material for both the participant and the practitioner. Practice self-awareness and examination, seek supervision when needed. Participants may experience crisis or spiritual emergency and provide appropriate medical and psychological care.
Lori and I were discussing this last week, and we concluded that the easiest way to allow social workers to do this work would be for NASW to say, yes, social workers who are trained in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy can do this work, and if they do, they must follow the MAPS Code of Ethics. I think that would be the easiest thing for them to do.
And the MAPS Code of Ethics is easily found on the MAPS website, if you would like to look it up.
It's at maps.org.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the FDA. The FDA has been publicly supportive of clinical trials for psychedelics, surprisingly so. And MDMA was granted phase 3 status. Psilocybin's in phase 2. So if you're not familiar with FDA approval, phase 1 is non-human subjects. Phase 2 is human subjects, but a much smaller sample size. And then phase 3 is the biggest, largest clinical trial. This is thousands of participants. And one of the things we know about research is the bigger the sample size, the more valid the results are in terms of our ability to generalize those results to the public, to the general population. This is how we really understand not only the benefits of medications, but also the side effects and the risks associated with taking it. One of the problems with psychedelic research is that we really can't get away with a double-blind research study. So meaning that in a double-blind research study, you have a placebo and you have a psychedelic. And in the double-blind, neither the patient nor the researcher or practitioner is supposed to know whether they're getting the placebo or whether they're getting the psychedelic. Well, it's very obvious, I think, at least to the practitioner, within 30 minutes, you know whether or not the patient received the placebo or not. So does that really have an impact on the research? I would say, yes, it does. When we look at the Controlled Substances Act, which was passed in 1970 during the Nixon administration, and this is where national laws and policies are about drugs. And so, as you probably know, in states where marijuana or cannabis is legal, like California, it tends to be an all-cash business. And the reason for that is those dispensaries cannot get a bank account because banks are scared that if they do business with a drug that is still, or a business who deals in drugs that is still illegal at the federal level under the Controlled Substances Act, that they might get in trouble too. So obviously we're going to have to make some changes to the Controlled Substances Act. And my hope is that in addition to the complete, legalization of cannabis, that we also make policies for how psychedelics can be used therapeutically.
Training to become a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist. So there are several different organizations that do training. The main one, though, is MAPS. But MAPS is doing MDMA specific training right now. So time varies between different organizations offering the training. MAPS training is broken up into 5 parts and takes at least 13 days plus time for supervision and evaluation to complete. The training begins with an outline course followed by a 7-day retreat. It also offers an opportunity for trainees to engage in MDMA assisted therapy, but only if they choose to and if they're eligible to do so. Before the last section, there's a practice session where trainees engage in a role play scenario. And then the last section of the training is supervision and evaluation, where the trainee is supervised and treating a participant. The cost has not been announced for 2020, but it seems to cost somewhere around $10,000.
So Michael Pollan wrote in his book about the underground practitioners, people who are doing this work illegally. And he was able to tap into this network of people. He interviewed several and actually received psychedelic assisted psychotherapy from several. The truth is, we really don't know how many underground practitioners there really are. Most of them, the older ones, might have actually done this in the late 60s when it was still legal. And some of them have been trained by people who did it back when it was legal. I think some of these people will come out and become legitimate and join in the research studies. Others may choose not to. When MAPS was started, they had to ask these bad boys in mental health how to show them how it's done. They had all this research and all these papers, but nobody really knew how the therapy side of this worked. And so they had to recruit some of these practitioners to show them what psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is and how it works. One of the major differences between the legal MAPS PAP and the underground people is that the MAPS people use a co-therapy model where a male-female therapist are both in the room for dosing sessions. As far as I can tell, the underground practitioners don't do that. It's the same therapist by themselves the whole way through. So what are the implications of this? And where do we go from here? We are ripe for a new paradigm in mental health. For the last 50 years, we've had this conflict between biologically based treatment and psychodynamic treatment. And each of those two camps has been fighting one another for legitimacy and for resources. And so the age-old question in our profession is mental illness a disorder of chemistry, or Is it a loss of meaning in one's life? Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is the wedding of these two approaches. And here are some reasons why I believe we're perfectly positioned for a paradigm shift. The first is that our current medications don't cure anything. They simply address the symptoms that you have, and really not very effectively, I might add. For moderate to mild depression, antidepressants offer an effect slightly better than placebo. And antipsychotics and mood stabilizers are so toxic to our bodies that we have to get regular blood testing to make sure that a patient's liver isn't being destroyed in the process. These drugs are not very effective, and they have a lot of dangerous and troubling side effects. If I refer one of my patients to go see a psychiatrist, I warn them that it's not necessarily going to feel like psychotherapy. Psychiatrists ask about symptoms because that's really what they treat. They manage symptoms, and no one ever talks about a cure, ever. The second reason is that we are suffering. We have never been more aware of issues of mental health, and as a result, there is much more demand. And, we can say whatever we want about Dr. Phil, but one of the things he did was he made it okay for Americans to say, I need help. He made therapy seem like something that anybody could participate in. There are more people right now on psychotropic medications than ever before. We have Prozac in our tap water because it can't be filtered out due to the number of people who are taking it. And psychotherapy is useful, but it does have its limits due to its lack of access to the psyche and the unconscious. We are in the midst of an opioid crisis, and we don't have enough beds in treatment centers. And most people cannot even afford actual quality treatment. We have a new wave of teens that are now addicted to nicotine thanks to the vaping craze. We are perfectly positioned to make radical discoveries and innovation in the way we think about mental health. And the initial research data is very promising. Imagine a world where we can cure PTSD, where we can make depression a thing of the past, where we don't have to take medication or feel the frustration of traditional therapies not working, even though we're so desperate to feel better. Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is emerging of the neuroscience with the existential psychodynamic community. Psychiatry may look very different in 10 years. We should be so lucky. And psychedelic assisted psychotherapy could be useful even for those who don't struggle with addiction or mental illness. We see every year, sociologists tell us that more and more people are leaving religion. 1 in 4 Americans identifies as atheists. What will fill the spiritual gap for us during this trying time? We're more divided now than we've been in decades. How do we learn to see each other's humanity? Psychedelics might offer a mechanism for us to find inner peace, to quiet our neuroses and stamp out our prejudices. How nice would it be to allow that inner child within to come out and play? And this is not just a therapy for those who suffer the most. This is a mechanism to heighten our understanding of ourselves and each other. While society and technology become increasingly complicated, maybe there are some things that can become more simple. Maybe we can learn to individually and collectively open our minds and hearts and find inner peace and social harmony. And I'm not exactly sure what this would look like, but imagine a world where you can use your vacation time for a spiritual retreat. Or maybe you go to a mental health club once a year for your birthday or to commemorate an anniversary and you have a psychedelic journey. Maybe we would have sick time and vacation time and spirituality time or self-care time. We could incorporate psychedelics in a lot of different ways. We could use it in social work education to help our students to deal with their bias. And what if foster parents who are trying to get their kids back and are working a case plan could really quickly and easily make some major changes in their life while that clock is ticking and be reunited with their kids? Imagine using this for women who are ambivalent about their violent relationship and what this could do to help them to move forward. There really may be endless potential here. Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy could change addiction, mental illness, and trauma, but it might also be able to change the world. Now, we know the greatest barrier to mainstreaming this intervention will be personal and collective bias. These compounds were made illegal in the first place because they were demonized by those who saw LSD as a threat to authority. We need to educate people about this intervention. We need to be meticulous and systematic in our research and data collection. Research will only take us so far. I mean, look at climate change. We have the data, but misinformation and prejudice and bias make it nearly impossible for us to take serious precautions to slow global warming or develop alternative fuel sources. The same thing can happen with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. I tell my students that humans often fear things that they don't understand. There will be people who are against this simply because they don't understand it. And we must be vigilant in our messaging and educate the power brokers and decision makers. Our elected officials must be on board, and our clinicians and institutions must be on board too. The pharmaceutical industry will likely fight this intervention. MAPS will not take their investments because they don't want psychedelic assisted psychotherapy to be corrupted by greed. We have to be ready to advocate as social workers for our patients, our community, our society, and ourselves.
What you can do to help this movement. A great book to read is How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. You can donate to MAPS at maps.org. Educate your colleagues and supervisors about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. You can advocate for cancer centers and hospice organizations to pilot a PAP program, become a trained psychedelic assisted psychotherapist or a Zendo Project volunteer. Join MAPS and get involved. You can go to conferences and do continuing education on PAP. Or you could create a task force of interested social workers or therapists in your area to further the cause of PAP.
We want to issue a warning. Please do not go out and facilitate your own psychedelic experience with illegal drugs. Our research here has been strictly intellectual and academic. We do not condone the use of illegal psychedelic substances. And please don't join that underground network of illegal practitioners. If you are interested in this, learn more through legitimate avenues. When we did this presentation for NASW, this is where we asked participants to ask questions, but obviously we're not going to do that here. So we want to thank you for watching this talk, and thank you for your time and attention to this issue. We appreciate your interest in this topic, and we hope that you have a great trip. And here is our contact information. If you'd like to reach out to us, feel free to email us or give us a call. Thanks so much. Take care.